Hi everybody, I'm delighted to share my work with you today, and I'm grateful to the Rachel Carson Center for giving me this wonderful opportunity. My name is Munira and I teach anthropology at the American University in Cairo. I grew up in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War and I work on war. I recently completed a draft of my first book entitled A Landscape of War, Ecologies of Resistance and Survival in South Lebanon, and I will share a part of that work with you today. For many, war is an event dominated by violence, death, and destruction. But in my work and in my life, war is also a place of life. My book examines war not only as a violent event, but also necessarily as a place for life, a living environment. My book illuminates what a lively perspective on war can help us understand as scholars and as human beings living together on a dying planet. The hands of Fatima. The hands of Fatima are stained black. She sits in the intense heat of a July morning in a pool of bright shade under a makeshift canopy outside her home in a village in South Lebanon 1 year after the last war, threading tobacco. A year ago, almost to this day, Fatima was sitting where she is sitting now, like every morning at this time of the year, threading tobacco. Suddenly, the morning air was pierced by the blaring of the village mosque loudspeakers, and Fatima thought to herself as she continued threading that they were going to announce the results of the state school exams. Instead, the announcer proclaimed that morning's capture by Hezbollah, the resistance, of 2 Israeli soldiers, the event that sparked the 2006 July war. Soon after, bombs started to rain down as the Israeli Air Force took to the skies. Fatima's husband, Hussein, was at pasture with his goats, when all of a sudden he found himself lying on the ground, his animals scattered. Picking himself up, he gathered his herd and returned home with them, only then realizing that his hand pained him. Washing the soot off his blackened limb, he found a small piercing in the skin that continued to burn his flesh even after he had cleaned it. Hussein and his 55 goats at pasture had been hit by a white phosphorus bomb known locally as harra, the burner, a weapon that is banned by the Geneva Convention. Despite his peculiar injury and the bombs that continued to fall, the couple decided to not leave their home. Fatima could not leave her tobacco plants that were in high season and required daily picking and threading, and Hussein would not leave his 55 goats who also needed care. The couple had weathered such war storms before. The lively pull of their homestead that formed the entire basis of their livelihood outweighed the push of the explosive and deadly violence that had just reappeared in their lives. And so, like many across the rural borderland turned battlefield, they remained where they were, stuck in yet another war storm. There are no bomb shelters across the south, despite decades of recurring conflict. And so, like everybody else, Fatima and Hussein sheltered from the shelling in their single-level, flat-roofed village home, which, like many homes in places of giving earth and gentle climate, is built to embrace and let in the environment, not to block it out. Since it was a phosphorus wound, the hole in Hussein's hand continued to burn and only ceased consuming him when he held it underwater. The couple cowered in their home under constant shelling. Every bomb that fell, we couldn't see or breathe from the smoke and dust. We didn't have any windows or doors left to close. We crouched behind the cracked walls of our house as the war went on outside. Divine power is what kept us, Fatima recalls, pausing in a moment in her threading to point with a tar-blackened finger straight up towards the heavens, lifting her eyes skywards. There was no light, no food or water. It was sweltering summer. The mosquitoes ate us alive, and we were unable to step one step outside. By the end of the second week of the war, we were soaking semolina with tea from our larder in cold water and drinking it to stay alive. During a brief lull in the fighting on July 23rd, the couple left their home in search of medical help for Hussein, who was in constant desperate pain and getting weaker. By this time, the tobacco was withering on the stalk, and the goats would just have to fend for themselves. We left thinking we were already dead, says Fatima. Indeed, it was only when they had given up on life itself that Fatima and Hussein took the decision to abandon their plants and animals, their sources of life. The old couple walked along blasted roads and eventually made their way to the nearest hospital, where they found that the white phosphorus had burned Hussein's arm all the way to the blackened bone. His body was poisoned, and after a few days he died. His time was up. Fatima sighs deeply, with unfathomable sadness. She's very tiny, and her black-socked feet look like those of a child. Her face is smooth and almost expressionless, yet it's suffused with a mixture of resignation and sorrow. In 34 days of war, with land fighting, mortars, and aerial bombardment, Fatima's village was reduced to rubble. Fatima found 2 cluster bombs hanging from the apricot tree in her garden and harvested them herself with her own bare hands. A strange and deadly crop, but Fatima did not hesitate and did not fear. Who still has life will not die, she says with quiet conviction. Her beloved fruit trees were dry, dusty, and traumatized, and she nursed them back to life. With her husband gone, Fatima sold the remaining goats, and now her life is squared entirely upon tobacco. Now it's one summer after the war, and Fatima is back to working tobacco like all the summers of her life through wars and wars. During the 3-month tobacco harvest like now, she gets up before the first light to collect the pickings of the day while the leaves are still tender with dew. Back home, she sits on the ground to thread until noon. Fatima makes a net profit of about half of what the state-owned monopoly, the Régie, pays her for her tobacco at the end of the year, and this is what she lives from. But since it's only herself that she needs to support these days, she remains mostly self-reliant. The whole time that we were talking, she didn't miss a single beat with the maybar, the long, flat threading needle, stabbing at the rubbery leaves. And as I take my leave, she continues, leaf after leaf, thread after thread, year after year, war after war, until her time is up. Tobacco, lovingly called the nabt al-murra, the bitter crop, is passionately clung to by the farmers of South Lebanon's war-ridden borderland as a lifeline of last resort. This laborious and toxic cash crop makes them live when not much else does. Ad-dukhan ma'ayashna, they all say. Tobacco makes us live. Tobacco has allowed them, by living, to somewhat resist military occupation, as well as grinding poverty and state neglect. Today, tobacco continues to thrive, and its cultivators to survive in a borderland still mired in war. These images show how widely and deeply entangled tobacco is with every aspect of life across the borderland of South Lebanon. My book is about the life of war. It explores the life that goes on in the midst of enduring conflict by examining what I call resistant ecologies, vitalizing more than human relations that persist and make life amidst relentless and enduring forces of destruction. Unfolding as a journey through landscape, I ask how life is lived in a place of enduring war. South Lebanon is an agricultural borderland that since the 1948 Palestinian Nakba and the birth of Israel is also a perennial battlefield. Life in these parts, for the most part, revolves around tobacco farming, olive cropping, goat herding, and other forms of agriculture, generating subsistence and income, and making viable an ongoing presence in place. The southern borderland is also deeply entangled in an ongoing condition of war that cyclically erupts, disrupts, destructs, reconstructs, and has done for generations now. War in South Lebanon is by now a part of the living environment. It's generative of a kind of life that continues to be lived here. In this seasoned battlefield, agricultural cycles and seasons of war are interwoven and meshed and together shape the lived world. Agriculturally based livelihoods premised on known and predictable agricultural seasons, mawasim zira'iyye, are sustained across and through seasons of war, mawasim harb. In South Lebanon, life and war are rooted in the land, and hence landscape as the environment, the medium and substance of both living and warring, is the portal of this inquiry into the life of war. Defined by Ingold as the world as it is known to those who dwell therein and who inhabit its places and journey along the paths connecting them, landscape attunes us to the way in which war is lived and the living worlds that war creates. Far from a frozen rural scene, landscape as method defines a field of analysis without constraining it. It brings into view heterogeneous ecological assemblages that open up life as lived to a new understanding of a planetary politics beyond the hegemonic, the self-contained, the divided, the ideologically imposed. Relational, indeterminate, unfolding, landscape comprised of heterogeneous and lively ecologies is a methodological hesitation against concluding too much. The book condenses around what I call resistant ecologies, or survival collectives that grow around resistant practices sustaining life in frontline villages through seasons of war. These resistant ecologies of practice, an orientation and a phrase that I borrow from Isabel Stenger's, encompass human-plant, human-animal, human spirit, and human-human relations, such as farming the bitter crop of tobacco, as I described above, goat herding amidst cluster bombs and mines that I'll talk about in a minute, and tending to the protective spirits inhabiting nature that I won't get into today. The various resistant ecologies that my book examines describe how various life-sustaining yet ordinary practices become with, as Donna Haraway puts it, the militarized environments of war. In a place like South Lebanon, it's impossible to easily parse war and life. They are co-present, they coexist. The processes of cultivation and harvest, the profits as well as the risks involved, are always entangled with the ongoing condition of war. As I'll show in the following section, mines and unexploded bombs endure in the living environment long after bouts of military violence has ended, what Rob Nixon describes as slow violence. These deadly objects recreate practices of cultivation impacting life choices and livelihoods that proceed apace. In some cases, fields that are littered with explosives become off-limits and alternative spaces for cultivation are used, usually at a price that eats into already slim profits, and known minefields are abandoned and revert to wilderness. But more often than not, areas that are known to contain explosives continue to be used by those who cannot afford to avoid them as they go about securing their livelihoods and carrying on in an insecure and lethal setting, as we just saw and will see again. In my work, I draw attention to war as a place of life and to the combined agency of its human and more than human dwellers in resisting this sometimes deadly condition through ordinary acts of living. As Am Dawood, a frontline villager, sputtered in exasperation as I kept asking him about the mines while he described to me in loving detail how he cared for his beloved olive trees along the borderline. Ya binti, al-maut biriz al-insan. Daughter, death is in human livelihood. That's simply the way it is. من البحر للمطلة من هون لآخر معمر الله. From the sea to Metullah, from here to the very end of God's earth. Khalas, what can you do? Far from illustrating a fatalism often ascribed to peasants, the quintessential subalterns, such acceptance of the dimensions of surviving in this place, the making do, of just continuing to live here, demonstrates an active form of life-making. It shows us the everyday art of doing, the deft ability of ordinary people on the margins of the nation-state, of history, the social, economic, and political, but too often at the center of violent action, to navigate, inhabit, and in this way resist an always precarious, enduringly lethal terrain that remains the primary place and source of life and living. In German, the word for survival is Überleben, and I like this word for its focus on living. How to live and die in an explosive landscape. Goat herding is widely practiced across the southern borderland of Lebanon, and goats remain the most viable livestock in this volatile war zone because of their compatibility with wartime environments and ordnance. They can survive periods of scarcity during active war, occupations, or invasions by foraging for food and eating almost anything. But most crucially, goats are small and light and can graze in the borderland's many minefields without setting off the hidden explosives that are designed to kill humans, who are not as light-footed. Tikimiti Gilbert, head of the UN demining outfit, the UNMAC, the United Nations Mine Action Coordination Cell, working in South Lebanon in the aftermath of the 2006 war, said to me, "Goats are relatively light compared to a person. These things, the mines, can often take 5 to 7 kilograms of weight depending on the depth of the mine. So, generally, goats are not heavy enough to set them off, and farmers know this. And they also know that the good grazing land is inside the minefield fencing. The grass there is a lot better, and so they let their goats go inside and take the risk that these goats aren't heavy enough." So, the mine-neutralizing qualities of goats is well known among locals who send their goats to gone wild, delicious, and deadly mine pastures. In this way, an explosive military technology that endures in lived worlds long after conflict is over is both domesticated and resisted by a homegrown anti-mine survival collective. These beings, humans and otherwise, have no choice but to live in such deadly places, and these bombs are a part of their ordinary worlds. Hence, technologies of death become a part of the world as lived and must be ethnographically and analytically grasped as such. But it gets more complicated. During the 2006 war, and especially right as it came to a close, Israel sprinkled South Lebanon, villages, towns, roads, valleys, fields, orchards, gardens, homes, with 4.6 million cluster bombs, seeding the earth with explosives. Many of these sub-munitions came from expired stocks left over from the U.S. war in Vietnam that were gifted to Israel. Due to their age, a large number of the bombs failed to explode upon impact, remaining in the earth, in the words of Human Rights Watch, as, quote, a deadly legacy of unexploded duds that continue to kill and injure civilians on a daily basis and impede efforts to rebuild lives and livelihoods in the wake of conflict. End of quote. When I spoke with the head of the Danish demining outfit working in South Lebanon in the aftermath of the war, he said to me, "There is no strategic pattern to cluster contamination. It's pure contamination, pure obstruction of land. When you block the land, you block the farmer's livelihood." A former military man, the deminer, insisted that this cluster bombing of landscape was excessive of military purposes. It's pure terror what they've done. The resistance was not in such huge areas. It's pure terror to block access to the land that is so important. A farmer's field or orchard is not a battle tank. Everything is contaminated, he cried. No, fields and orchards are not battle tanks, but the ability of the southern farmer to continue to exist in this explosive landscape is a critical dimension of the resistant nature of life across seasons of war in South Lebanon and elsewhere. The borderland was flooded with bombs to disrupt the vital ecologies of living across the south. Indeed, after the war, as people returned to home, field, and orchard, scores were killed and injured by landmines and unexploded cluster bombs. A humanitarian campaign was launched to clear away the cluster bombs, and about 200,000 were removed. But since then, the clearing effort has petered out due to lack of funding, because humanitarian relief has a short attention span. More than 1 million cluster bombs, not counting landmines, remain in South Lebanon. According to this mines expert, relatively speaking, and despite its postage stamp size, Lebanon is the country worst affected by cluster bombs worldwide in terms of contamination density. Abu Nimr sits in the courtyard of his home, in the midst of his family. He looks lost, forlorn, and alone despite the hubbub all around him. The old goat herd had finally sold his entire flock, the last one just 2 months ago, and reluctantly given up his lifelong practice after difficulties encountered since the death of his son Ali in 2005. Ali was Abu Nimr's 5th child and the only one among his 10 siblings who left school and instead learned from his father and their goats how to walk the warscape. Ali had it in him, the old man said, rubbing his reddening eyes, which makes the blue of the irises stand out even more brightly. Ali was interested in the work. The moment he learned how to walk, he was walking with me and the goats. Ali learned to communicate with the beasts, and he had the stamina to be out in the wilderness under the sun all day. Ali continued to accompany his father and their flock of more than 500 goats through the borderland pastures in the hills around their village right on the border, and they would often run into trouble. More than once, they were shot at. The old man took a bullet in his arm and was detained and taken in for interrogation by the Israelis and their allies on numerous occasions. Abu Nimr found that his goats' alert temperament and nimble-footedness assisted him in navigating the militarizing landscape. Together they, humans and animals, learned to resist the military realities of their habitat. Goats sense danger before humans do. They would always tell me when something was not right, whether it was a snake in the bushes or Israeli infiltrators or guerrillas, Abu Nimr says. Abu Nimr continued goat herding during the years of the Palestinian guerrilla war along the border, through the 1978 and 1982 Israeli invasions and the 22-year Israeli occupation of the borderland. During the occupation, things became relatively easier for Abu Nimr and his goats as the lines of battle settled farther away north of their village and pastures. During the occupation, there were clear limits as to where we could go and when we could be at pasture, Abu Nimr says. During this time, one of his sons served as a soldier in the South Lebanon Army, the SLA, the Israeli allied local militia. This necessary sacrifice allowed the family some breathing room to continue to live within the occupation. As the rest of his sons neared adulthood, they left to Beirut to avoid forced conscription, and there one became a policeman, another a school teacher, and another a journalist. Abu Nimr, Ali, and the goats continued to walk the borderland. After the end of the occupation, Ali and his father continued to walk with their herd, selling kids, manure, milk. It was a decent living. As his father grayed, Ali began to take over more and more of the strenuous work. One bright cold day in November 2005, he was returning with the flock after a long day at pasture. The goats swarmed along the main road leading towards a village that runs adjacent to a well-known minefield that, due to years of lying fallow, is a field of flowing wild grasses. Heading home with the setting sun on his back, Ali came up behind the herd. To the right, the minefield snaked alongside the goat herd and his flock, and beyond it, the technical fence defining the northern limits of Israel slashed the landscape. Suddenly a goat lost her footing and stumbled down the short ledge to the meadow below. Although there are no markings that it was a minefield, Ali knew too well what this stretch of earth concealed. And yet, because the goat was pregnant, he acted in haste. Stepping off the asphalt to urge the goat back, he stepped on the mine that the goat probably trod on and did not trigger. In his rush to protect the life, Ali met his death. He was 33 years old. He left behind a wife, 2 young children, and an unborn child. His widow sits in a drift of tobacco as Abu Nimr tells the story. Her face is drawn and she's dressed in black. Her daughters, who are now 5 and 3, help with the work of shek, tobacco threading, and the boy, who's 7, hangs around listening to his grandfather tell the sad story he knows too well. Since Ali's death, Abu Nimr tried to take up goat herding again, but he couldn't manage. After falling and breaking his arm, his wife and children urged him to give it up, and soon he had no choice but to give in. Little by little, he sold his flock of 500. "I'm left alone without my goats," he says. The old man does look lost. He wanders over to thread some tobacco with the women and children, but he does it half-heartedly and soon drops the thread and begins to cry. Goats have persisted while other animals faltered, writes Penny Johnson in her book Companions in Conflict, Animals in Occupied Palestine. Goat herding in a militarized landscape is a tried and true practice that shows us some of the ways in which human-animal collaborators, what Anat Singh calls survival collectives and I call resistant ecologies, find ways to overcome the deadly limitations on life that the human-centered violence of war and weaponry impose. Military technologies of death, such as landmines and cluster bombs, are area-denying weapons, but the areas denied can be reverse-occupied by clever multi-species assemblages that can trick death machines designed to kill humans and transform now deadly landscapes into once again lively ones. But making live by tricking bombs is by no means an easy art or an accurate science, and the threat of death and livelihood is ever present. On July 5, 2017, Abu Nimr, now in his mid-80s and after decades of nimbly tricking technologies of death, stepped on a mine while herding his beloved goats and died. He had returned to goat herding soon after I last saw him in 2009. His wife and children had relented and allowed him to re-establish a smaller, more manageable herd when they saw that he truly couldn't live without his beloved beasts. On the day he died, a kid had wandered away from the flock and into the minefield. Like his son before him, he impulsively followed her, and in doing so stepped on a mine, or cluster bomb, that may or may not have always been there, and died. When I heard the news, I couldn't believe it at first. It was an almost scripted ending, and hence struck me as stranger than fiction. But there was nothing strange or fictional about it. Mines and cluster bombs are real, enduring, violent legacies of war that constitute and shape the local geographies, lifeways, and deaths of those who must live with them. For those who must live in war, resistant life is crafted amidst the agents, objects, and time spaces of extended conflict. But I do not want to normalize war here. Far from it. While I ethnographically begin in the presence of war, this is not a naturalizing move. What I want to do is to describe life in war without rendering war as other, an exotic elsewhere, a negative space where the social is suspended and violence rules. War is more often theoretically grasped from more distant, peaceful worlds as an exception. It's most commonly ethnographically accessed by observers who have not lived it as strange, barbaric, as a lamentable lapse into a known and avoidable state of savagery. Here instead, I seek to recognize and render war as a place of life, a milieu, an environment that unsettles commonplace understandings of war. Since the end of World War II, with the exception of Northern Ireland and the Balkans, wars have been largely confined to the global south. Although they are as globalized as any process in capitalism, and apart from the unwelcome migrants and refugees that they generate, wars have been largely contained to other worlds and are not immediately, experientially, and imaginatively accessible to those of us inhabiting more peaceful quarters in the global north. The ways in which this has shaped war as a conceptual object is profound and has not been sufficiently acknowledged. For example, war, because it takes place in far-off elsewheres, and unlike industry and plantations, for example, is rarely included in literature on the Anthropocene. The fact that war takes place elsewhere determines how war is thought about, researched, and written about. I want to think and write about war differently. I want to think of war as a living environment, and through this to stake out a place for the inhabitants of war and the experience of war as a part of this world and not its exception. That is to say, thinking of war ecologically helps us to begin to decolonize our understandings of war. Living and writing and speaking from the global south, where wars are ongoing struggles deeply bound up with present-day imperial and capitalist projects, contests and interests, I insist that war, as experience, as analytical object, must take its place alongside other more normalized sites of industrial ruin that many beings have little choice but to inhabit and thus contend with as a part of their lot on this damaged, dying earth. War is not an elsewhere. This book shapes my refusal of what Michel Rolfe-Trouillot called the savage slot. In this book, I show that war is a human experience that is continuous in coherence with the worlds we comfortably inhabit, even if these worlds of war appear temporally, spatially, existentially removed from our sense of the ordinary. The object of war that I hold and behold in my book is an ethnographic composite of intimate experience, mine and others, and scholarly labor. By shedding light on life in war, I want to explode the boundary between civilized and savage, to decolonize hegemonic understandings of war and peace. When we understand war as a condition emergent from the same social, political, economic, ecological processes that make our peaceful world, only then can we recognize our shared humanity, our collective vulnerability, our complicity. This has implications for all of us dwelling on a dying planet amid swirling, layered, violent regimes that we are only beginning to recognize as deeply interconnected and existentially threatened and threatening. This should make us more politically sensitive, more politically aware, more insistent on shaping more equitable and inclusive and less violent political realities, institutions, worlds. For those who inhabit it, war is, whether they want it or not, a living environment, a life world that necessitates a vital reliance on others and always handy plan B. In such a life world, one always hopes, but one can never know if the sun will rise tomorrow. The creative survival strategies that grow in these deadly worlds of war are the resistant ecologies that underwrite life and that grow in all of modernity's wreckages. For a large number of those we share this planet with, who are less fortunate than us, the end of the world is nothing new. Inhabitants of war have been facing up to such unhappy endings time and again. Rather than simply pitying them, we may also learn something from them. Inspired by my experience of life in war and drawing upon years of fieldwork and friendship in the enduring war zone of South Lebanon, I approach war as a habitable place, because for those who live it, it has to be. By insisting on war as a lived environment, I foregrounded vital dimensions of worlds of war, while also recognizing war as a violent event and a force of destruction. The recognized co-presence of the forces of destruction and creation generates the peculiarities of life here in South Lebanon, and in Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Mozambique, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Colombia, and other war-ridden locales across the global south, where a condition of war has simmered and exploded across generations, impacting life and land, even across times of calm. It is imperative that war is analytically treated as a part of life. It is lived that way. Thank you.